Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. We're going to strictly stay within 60 minutes for this webinar, so we want to get started, and we'll have a hard stop at 11 Central Time. But let me kick this off. Welcome to everybody. When I saw the people who've signed up for this, we have a daunting and impressive group of Texas leaders on this call. So thanks to everybody for making the time to join us in this webinar on just talking about taking action on infrastructure opportunities, especially for underserved communities in Texas. Excuse me if I seem a little disoriented. It's actually raining outside, and I'm not sure what to make of that, but that's some good news. I'm Hank Habicht. I'm the co-founder of the Water Finance Exchange, and I'm honored to be here with three colleagues that I love to work with. So let me just ask Carlos and Sarah and Rogelio to introduce yourselves briefly as we get started.
Let's go with Sarah first.
Okay.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah Schlesinger. I'm the CEO of Texas Water Foundation. We are a statewide nonpartisan nonprofit that works in the areas of water policy, in workforce and leadership initiatives, and are building a statewide water campaign. Pleased to be here.
Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Name is Carlos Rubenstein. I am an advisor to WFX and a board member of the Water Finance Exchange. Formerly, in a previous life, served as in various capacities in the state of Texas, ultimately serving as commissioner of TCEQ and chairman of the Water Development Board. And proud to be here today to talk about the opportunities to advance water infrastructure in Texas.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Rogelio Rodriguez, and I am the Texas director for the Water Finance Exchange. My background is public finance. I worked with communities all over the country, especially in Texas, to help facilitate projects and get them from thought to funding. And so I'm focused on that at the Water Finance Exchange, working with communities every day.
Thanks very much. This is a great group. And I just try to stay out of the way and help us all make progress. But this is a group of four friends and colleagues, and we're all privileged to work on water in Texas. And having done it for a number of years, I think all of us have a sense of humility about what we're dealing with. But what we want to do is just have a discussion today. I'll kick us off. And by the way, the chat function will be the place for your questions, and we want to leave plenty of time to take questions. And also, Jackson Parr, our impresario here, is going to, I think, put in the chat a link to a document about the outputs of the legislature, which we'll talk about shortly today. But feel free to put your questions in the chat at any time. So I'll kick us off briefly, and then we'll want to hear from the experts after that. I think the key point is that working with underserved communities in Texas and everywhere is really a work in progress. It's even though the challenges of smaller underserved communities have been with us for a long time as a major focus, it's never been we've never had quite the focus that we have right now. And I think that's great. So all of this is a work in progress. And again, we have the humility to start by saying we don't have all the answers. This is not a webinar to give you all the answers on how to approach these issues. But because the issues are so important and there's so much happening, we think it's really important to just have a discussion. And there are other forums that are having good discussions on this. And we want to just continue to discuss, kind of what the challenges are, the opportunities are, because we've never had this kind of convergence of interest and resources around underserved communities in Texas, and we want to get it right. So having said that, I think I would say that the reason we wanted to do this sooner rather than later is because it's a critical time. We see the convergence of a whole bunch of factors that are important for this topic. And I'll just mention three of them. First of all, as we'll hear about today, the Texas Legislature was active on water, and there have been there's been legislation that provides new funding and new tools, some of which will be outlined in your handout, that present great opportunities. So that's point one. Point two is that federal infrastructure funding is really flowing now. I think, it's the infrastructure laws have been in place for a while. It's taken a while for things to, again, it's a new field. A lot of things are coming into place, but right now funding is flowing significant funding is flowing to the states and to these entities called environmental finance centers, which are designed to help provide technical assistance to smaller communities. So that's starting to take shape, and it's really important to have a coordinated approach to that, and for the states to have the authorities they need to have to implement that. And third, and last but not least, is because of work many of us have done over the last 2 years, we have a much better idea now of what the real needs are in the field. And it's definitely an all hands on deck situation. We'd like to think that, gee, if the money's there, we just need to help people fill out application forms and everything will be solved. But we know it's not that simple. We know these communities have a lot of challenges. They need a lot of assistance and partnering. And so we want to make sure that we capture what are the biggest needs and that we're finding out there, and how do we deploy all of the resources represented on this call to make things happen. And the communities are in, not only do they just have basic challenges about infrastructure, but those are exacerbated by drought this summer in many parts of the state. In some cases, more rain, but it's mostly drought. And the alternative, it's sort of the alternatives of both rapid economic growth, which is causing a lot of dislocation, but also economic distress in some parts of the state, all of which affect infrastructure. So we could go to slide 2. So what we want to do today, and I'll stop here in a minute, is share some practical perspectives on all of these developments and how they impact on these communities in need. First, just a quick introduction on the Water Finance Exchange. We know many of you, but we're a neutral nonprofit intermediary. We work in several states, hand in hand with communities. Our focus is working on the ground with communities to build models that can be replicated, where we can learn what the challenges are and help get to scale. So we work in several states, but by far our focus is Texas right now, and our goal is to catalyze funding and to catalyze models that provide what we call community-friendly finance and governance approaches that are sustainable, because it's not just putting the pipes and pumps in place, but having sustainable governance going forward. We're building an approach to technical assistance that is comprehensive, and everything we do is based on the belief that sustainable and affordable water is inextricably tied up with economic development and growth. We work with over 30 communities in Texas, in Southwest, East, and North Texas, and we partner and build on the good work of many organizations, especially ones that like Communities Unlimited and Texas Rural Water Association. So my last point, and then we'll get to our experts. I would say as you listen to this and think about the challenges, I would put forth maybe 2 primary themes that will be woven through our discussion today. First, technical assistance is the critical vehicle for achieving for getting communities funded and getting sustainable systems in place. I don't think we get there without effective technical assistance, and technical assistance is multifaceted. It's financial, social, technical, many factors, and really nothing important can be left out for us to be effective. And just as one example, one of the things you find often is water losses are very significant in many communities, and that's a big opportunity in a focal area. So technical assistance is a critical theme that we really want to focus on. And second, while regional approaches are not always the right answer, it's very important in every case to look at potential opportunities for regional collaboration, because the regional focus provides for economies of scale to make these systems sustainable, and also it provides a vehicle for communities to collaborate around issues that they share, which includes water supply, water conservation, and the health of their watersheds. So there we go. I think that's I think we can go to so what I would like to do is ask Carlos, Sarah, and Rogelio any opening thoughts you have, and then we'll get right into the legislative picture.
Well, I'll go first. Hank, I couldn't agree with you more. I think one of the things that we also need to recognize is and we'll be talking a little bit in just a second about what occurred during this legislative session and the opportunities that are coming. But at the same time, we need to recognize that the clock is ticking. You mentioned that money is available and it's flowing. Availability and the fact that it's flowing doesn't mean that the right communities or the communities that are most in need are yet able to access it. And I think that our discussion today will focus on how to better position those communities to be able to take benefit of the money that is targeted specifically to meet their needs. In Texas, because of the great work that the legislature did during this last regular session, and the water universe in Texas speaking probably for the first time in a long time with one singular voice about the needs that need to occur, led to substantive legislative action that is going to make even more funding available, provided that Texans approve it during the election that's coming up in November. Texas has a history of supporting these kind of activities in the past, strongly supporting them. I would bet dollar to donuts that the Proposition 6 is going to pass, and additional money for small, disadvantaged, and rural communities will be available. And so that makes the discussion today that much more critical. Over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Carlos. Agreed, Hank, and thank you always for bringing up these themes and opportunities to discuss how it is that Texas is tracking with national trends as well. And so I know that that's a lot of what we'll be setting as a landscape here in a moment.
Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, I want to echo some of the comments you made, Hank. Being down in communities on a daily basis, I see a lot of motivated communities, a lot of excitement coming from this new federal and state funding that's out there as a catalyst to get communities engaged, thinking about water infrastructure. But to your point, we're also seeing a lot of gaps in that process. And so looking at technical assistance and what that exactly means and what those gaps are, I think are going to be a good part of today's discussion.
Absolutely. So as we move into slide 3, Jackson, let me clarify that I think I mentioned the chat. If you have questions, the most efficient way to do it is there's a Q&A function in your toolbar, and please put your questions through the Q&A function on the toolbar. But let me turn it over to Sarah and Carlos to talk about the experience that we had with the legislature over the last session and the things that came out of it and their potential implications.
Thanks, Hank. So I find that it's always helpful to start off with painting a big picture about where we find ourselves in history. And the first thing that I'll state is that Texas has the tendency to be unique on a national scale in how it has approached water policy. And in many of those cases has been really championed some innovative policy efforts, especially over the course of the past 20 years in creating water infrastructure funding mechanisms with state water plans, with a statewide flood plan as well. But what was particularly unique about this session, I found, is that Texas tracked surprisingly close to some of the national trends, which I don't think has really been the case in the past. And what I mean by that, and Hank had referenced earlier, a convergence point, is the theme nationally has really been a focus on aging and deteriorating infrastructure, and specifically those communities who are being most impacted by it. And so that was very evident, of course, in the adoption or approval of the Bipartisan Infrastructure and Jobs Act at the end of 2021, in this course correction of making available federal dollars for water infrastructure improvements with a particular focus on rural and underserved communities. And as Hank mentioned, some of the technical assistance that's needed to access that funding. So in Texas, part of the way that we can clearly see visible some of this thematic trend towards looking at water infrastructure is some of the very visible displays of why our water infrastructure is aging and deteriorating. So you can think back at some of the statewide water outages that occurred during Winter Storm Uri. You can think about the high prevalence of boil water notices that have occurred, particularly in the past year, and of course the impacts of drought. And I would say very markedly, which I think really painted some of the tone of this session, was the emergence of some really staggering water loss reports in stark contrast to the water supply projections that we had. So the reason that Texas is tracking remarkably similar to the national trend, of course, is because most of our water infrastructure nationally was funded through the last wave of federal investments 50 years ago. And a lot of that infrastructure is now nearing the end of its useful lifespan, right? So from a time scale perspective, I think that's the reason that Texas was tracking so similarly. And there was this national and statewide similarity. Now, going into session, we knew three things that would forecast what we would see during this session, which was a good water policy session. The first is that three of our primary state agencies that have jurisdiction that deal with water, the Texas Water Development Board, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, and the Public Utility Commission, were all going to be going through sunset review. And sunset is the process by which the legislature determines, it's essentially an audit, whether a state agency is meeting its statutory obligations, right? And so through that process, which started before session, we already knew that there was going to be a focus on how funds were being dispersed through the Texas Water Development Board, which communities were going to have were accessing funds, a look at how water quality was being determined, a focus on boil water notices, so on and so forth. So we knew that that was already going to be a vehicle through which good water policy discussions would occur. The second thing that we knew going into session is that Texas was very fortunate to be going into the 88th Texas Legislature with a significant budget surplus, over $32 billion. And that was going to provide an opportunity, but also was going to turn up a lot of competition in trying to access some of that funding to address some really significant issues. And the third final topic that we knew was going to inform this legislative session was the fact that there was going to be a lot of focus on infrastructure, not just because of the national trends, but also because state leadership in the governor's office, in the lieutenant governor's office, and the speaker's office had identified infrastructure broadly as one of their priorities. So that gave us an opportunity between the state agencies going through sunset, the budget surplus, and then this focus on infrastructure to really deal with and advance some meaningful policy around water infrastructure and water infrastructure funding in particular. So I would say, just as a big picture, that was kind of the tone and the discussion going into it. And the result was a remarkably coordinated effort amongst a very large ecosystem of nonprofits and statewide groups, trade associations dealing with water, to really address and try to drive home the opportunity to access that funding. So I'll kick it over to you, Carlos, to talk about what came out of it.
Thank you, Sarah. Well said. And I'm glad that you ended with how all of this ability to resonate with the national discussion on water also resonated with the various water groups in Texas that led to significant action during the legislative session. We have on the slide and on the handout that Jackson put on the chat, on the link to it, several bills that were able to make it all the way through the legislative session. You know, sessions are interesting. You get tons of bills filed, but actually very few that actually make it to the end. But all of the ones that you see on this slide made it through the end, and they are now effective in Texas. We have highlighted three of them in particular, but all of these are important. Senate Bill 28 is a bill that Texans will all get to have a say-so in this coming election in November, because it establishes a new fund that I think was exceptionally well thought of. The fund targets the creation of 7 million acre-feet of water between now and 2030. You know, previously when you have funding bills that pass, it is all about how quickly can you get the money out. This is results oriented. It is how quickly can we develop the new sources of water to meet our future needs in Texas, because we're experiencing, as Sarah mentioned, huge population growth. We know that our existing sources of water are declining. And so having a bill that provides money, both in various very flexible formats, for folks to be able to move the projects that today can generate new sources of water is important. Senate Bill 28 also strikes a very good balance, an exceptional balance on the value of water. Not only will it fund the development of new source supply, but it also wants to focus very clearly on the protection and valuation of water as a whole. So a great portion of the money is targeted for identification and repair relative to line loss. We know, and Sarah mentioned this in her summary, that we have staggering amounts of water loss throughout Texas. Water loss represents not only the actual loss of the resource, but the loss of revenue for the utility and the increased costs associated with water that you're treating that is not being put to beneficial use. Senate Bill 28 targets the identification and repair of that sector of the infrastructure. Senate Bill 28 also focuses on the fact that communities that don't have the institutional capacity within their structure to be able to advance their projects through the application process, that they need technical assistance. And so we're looking at small, rural, and disadvantaged communities. In fact, Senate Bill 28 specifically notes that it wants to target communities of 150,000 people or less to be able to be targeted for receipt of these kinds of funds. I think that will absolutely be critical for those folks to also have them. House Bill 1 is also a critical bill that passed. It is the state budget, but included in there was some additional funding for the Water Development Board that was much appreciated. But it also fully funded the state match to be able to pull down the money that's available from the federal government on the IIJ funding, the federal funds that went for infrastructure. House Bill 3232 is a bill that incentivizes aid to small, disadvantaged, non-compliant utility systems. You know, you have communities that have the ability to assist another community that is in need and has compliance issues. But one of the problems or disadvantages in doing that is you don't want to take on that community that you're trying to help, where you're trying to do the right thing. You don't want to take on their history on negative compliance. House Bill 3232, Safe Harbor Bill, would allow now and incentivize participation among willing communities to assist those that need a hand up to be able to get to a compliant state without it negatively impacting the communities that are willing to come in and assist. So in other words, you're no longer going to have a situation where you're penalizing a community for doing the right thing. There are other bills that are also highlighted here. They are in your handout, and for the interest of time, we will not cover them. But I will tell you that they deal with addressing workforce issues and incentivizing the ability to be able to get licensed the work operators for the plants themselves. I think that will be a great advantage, particularly to high school students, and also better definitions of small and rural communities that will clarify which ones are able to participate. Rogelio, over to you.
Thank you, Carlos. That's a great summary of those important bills that we've already kind of seen in action in some of the communities that we're working with. I want to go to the next slide, the future of water infrastructure in Texas, and just talk a little bit about what we're seeing down in the communities and in our discussion with communities. Right now, we're working with 30 plus communities at the Water Finance Exchange in Texas. 3-4 of them are regional coming togethers of communities that have decided to take on water infrastructure as a group. So there's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of communities that want to address their water infrastructure, and they using the federal funding and state funding news that's out there as a real catalyst to get those communities interested. So we're seeing a lot of communities call us talking about the problems they have. And so part of our charge is to get those communities and turn those problems into projects. And we spend a lot of time looking at communities and looking at their big kind of infrastructure needs and turning them into organized projects. We work with a lot of other collaborative NGOs. We work with engineers and directly with the communities that are motivated to get these things done so that we can solve those problems and come with good, tangible, fundable projects. The other part of that is really about affordability. And as communities walk down this road, they realize that there's not 100% grant funding out there anymore. And so they're going to have to take on some level of burden to be able to afford these projects, even in a cheaper way. So one of the things that we're always focused on is what we're calling the psychology of affordability. Being able to give communities transparent quantitative methods, cash flows, pro formas, rate impact analysis, so that they can get a sense of what exactly it means to their community. And we do this all through the process because it's important for everybody to know that this application process and this funding may come at a cost, and what is that cost. The other part of it is really looking at the application process and working with them to demystify that process. It can be a long, arduous process that requires a lot of information. And so the professionals and the experts at Water Finance Exchange really want to be part of that administrative staff capacity to help those applications go through. We spend a lot of time working on what the points mean, how to word projects, how to make sure that they're reflective of what the community is trying to do. And so that is a big part of demystifying that process. And we bring those elements to communities. We do a lot of this really for the transparency and decision making, right? There's a lot of things that have to go into what the ultimate goal of building that infrastructure and providing good, clean water service to a community. And so those elements are really pivotal in getting that community to keep moving forward. Obviously, what's a big need and what we're seeing out there are communities that are interested still need a lot of what we call the base documentation to really engage in that funding process. What does that mean? It means audits. And to what Carlos and Sarah have been talking about, water loss audits. It means in any sort of environmental that may be necessary. And so a lot of communities don't have all those things ready. And so we spend time working with them kind of in a parallel track to project designing and capital planning so that we can have a community that's really ready for funding. But more than that, we see IIJA, this money, this federal money that has come down, as a good catalytic way for communities to get interested in addressing their infrastructure. But we also are trying to look beyond that. So some of the visions of the future that we have are how to give communities more agency. After the 5-year IIJA period, what are we really leaving with communities? So we spend a lot of time looking at certain metrics and benchmarks and documents and governance procedures that we think can help really stand up communities so that they can do a lot of this on their own once that 5-year IIJA period is over. We're also looking at other financial innovations that can help communities really embed that agency into their ongoing plan. One of the things that we want to avoid and that we always look at is what is the capital plan, and how do we keep that capital plan from just sitting on the shelf, but helping communities move that capital plan along. Capital plans can sometimes be very expensive. And when you design a capital plan, meaning when you put in all the projects in there that you think your community would benefit from, how do you fund them through time? That's something that we help communities decipher. And in that rate impact modeling, we make sure that communities know that year 1, this is what you should plan to do, year 2, year 3, and so on, all based upon a community's desire for what it wants to accomplish. One of the things Hank said in the beginning is we're a neutral party, and we truly try to be a neutral party, right? We're not here to tell you what plans to do, who to hire and who to work with. We're really just trying to get you some good information so you can move your projects forward and provide a good basis foundation for economic development, growth, and prosperity. So that's a big charge of the Water Finance Exchange. And we do that through our experts, right? I'm a finance expert. We have regulatory experts, operational. We have application experts. And so when we're down in the community, we really see that adding that capacity to help them move forward is a huge part of what we're trying to accomplish. The other part of what we see in communities is there's often a need for one or two things to get done, right? It could be a financial audit, it could be a water loss audit, it could be engineering plans. And so the Water Finance Exchange has a pre-development fund that we deploy to help get those catalytic tasks done. We see a lot of those tasks as a way to move communities past any sort of roadblock and really get them to a point where their funding applications look great. They're very competitive. And so that's part of what we do as well. So we try to bring a holistic approach to communities to really get them involved in what they want to do. There's several examples we can point to where we've had community groups as big as 38 members tell us what they feel is important in their community. And oftentimes it's a mix of projects, right? It could be everything from pipes and pumps to rain catchment to fixing some of the natural elements that are there to help replenish the aquifers. So all of those things are very important, and we help communities kind of organize those elements so that we can move them forward. And so what I see for the future are very excited communities, communities that have not really ventured into how to address their water infrastructure are getting very excited about the funding potential, about cleaning their water systems, and really looking at their neighbors to try to figure out, how do we all get together? How do we all make this very affordable? And so those are huge elements that we talk through every day in our work. And that's really kind of what we kind of see as the future of water infrastructure. You know, obviously there's some pivotal elements that we want to continue to focus on and use SB 28 as that gets approved and that funding gets allocated to address water loss and to address that regional opportunity that communities can have. So I'll turn it over to Hank, Carlos, and Sarah if they have anything to add.
That's great, Rogelio. And I would just add, again, we started by talking about being humble, humbled by the magnitude of the challenge and opportunity, and want to emphasize that as far as Water Finance Exchange goes, we are not, we're part of the solution. We look to fill gaps and are part of the solution, and that's important. We're starting to get some questions. I'm encouraging you to put questions in the Q&A, and we'll start to get to those in just a second. I'll just ask the other panelists for any thoughts you have. I mean, the one thing I would add is that in our humble opinion, there is not an agreed definition of what technical assistance is yet, either in Texas or in the country. And there's a lot of people who just assume they know what it is, like many things. But as we say, it's multifaceted. And there are, and now with these environmental finance centers being created under the infrastructure, IIJA, they'll be implementing technical assistance and providing money for technical assistance and that sort of thing. But for us, and for the purpose of this discussion, the Texas Water Development Board is the focal point for how technical assistance moves forward, as well as TCEQ for how technical assistance is defined and moves forward in Texas. And I guess the point I would want to emphasize is that in our view, technical assistance begins before a community even makes it onto the intended use plan, which is the key first step for being eligible for funding from the Texas Water Development Board. It starts before that because there's a lot of things that have to happen for them to make it onto the intended use plan. It carries through the whole process and continues into the community establishing a governance structure, O&M plans. And then secondly, it extends outside the community and encompasses how the community relates to impacts and is impacted by developments in the watershed and the region where they're located, because they share water resources and that sort of thing. And finally, technical assistance needs to look at where do we go after IIJA money, and are there other sources of capital that can be tapped? So those are just thoughts about, a very important priority is getting our arms around what technical assistance means in Texas and how do we do it efficiently and effectively. But Sarah and Carlos, what would you add? And then we'll get to questions.
Hank, what I would add is that we need to recognize that technical assistance has to evolve beyond pointing an entity to where the money is available. That is very important. Telling them the things that they need to do to be able to qualify for funding is important. But if you just stop there and you've pointed them to where the money is available, and tell them what they need to do, and you walk away, you're leaving still that entity probably with a lack of the human resources that they need compared to the larger utilities to be able to navigate the process. And so to your point of the lack of definition of technical assistance, I think we also find that technical assistance means different things to each community. And that's why it's important to come in and, as Rogelio stated, understand what those community needs are. Yes, point them to what they possibly qualify for. Yes, tell them how it is that they can get in line to compete for that money, but also walking them through that process. And I think that is the critical element where we have a lot of great entities in Texas that are trying to do that. The need is beyond the capacity of all of us that are trying to do technical assistance, recognizing that hand-holding and walking down the road with them so that you can actually not measure how many communities did you reach out to, but how many communities were you successful in getting them to a point where they actually were able to pull down money. I think that's a critical element in how we need to start viewing technical assistance as well.
I'm glad you brought that up, Carlos, because what occurred to me as just kind of a zooming out thought again, as I listened to you, Rogelio, is the human dimension of all of this, right? You talked a lot about the agency and capacity of communities and the challenges that you are encountering as you work with them. And one of the topics that I felt was really an undercurrent in the statewide discussion, I think will continue to be moving into next session, around workforce and around what that means from a technical capacity in terms of institutional knowledge and resilience moving forward beyond the technical capacity that entities like Water Finance Exchange and Communities Unlimited and Texas Rural Water Association can provide, is where within the individual communities there's also the institutional capacity to move through this work. And then again, zooming out further, I think one of the other elements that is worth noting is, as you can tell from this presentation, a discussion around water infrastructure funding, and the technical process by which you apply for it is complex. And it is in fact very, very technical, right? And so the leadership that was required at the Texas Legislature was tremendous in terms of making sure to include some of these very technical, nuanced topics like water loss, like technical assistance, right? To have that included in a statewide policy discussion was really tremendous. And it is also worth noting that Texas has been fortunate to have a number of really prominent water champions over several decades, but that we're also losing a lot of those water champions. So the institutional knowledge and capacity at the legislature is also shifting. So, we were very pleased to see Representative Tracy King form the first House Water Caucus in an effort to provide education on some of these very complex topics, but also to start to invest in the next generation of legislators that will continue to deal with these issues because they will continue to be complex.
That's great. So I think we've got some great questions, and I think it would be great. It would be good to jump into those. I'll take one. There was one of the first questions was, how is WFX funded, and do we charge entities for our services? Just want to quickly address that. We're blessed to be funded by philanthropy, particularly large Texas philanthropy, and we're very grateful for that. And that allows us to jump in with communities when we see a community, and we're we have a screening process. So we look for real potential and real leadership commitment in communities, but it allows us to jump in without upfront contracts and things like that. Our pre-development fund is revolving, so we hope to have that we repaid and also costs reimbursed. But that's the approach, because it's important to just be able to get in and work with these communities and build some models. With that, I think, Rogelio, you're going to fielding questions.
I will. And, Sarah, you were talking about the human element. And so I think this question is a great one for you. Considering that underserved communities will keep growing and scarcity keeps growing, how far is Texas from recognizing the human right to water? Do we need it? Is it useful?
Dr. Sanchez, what a wonderful question. And leave you to always bring the international context there. I think, well, first of all, it's worth stating that the UN did declare water a human right in its Declaration of Human Rights over a decade ago, right? So that is already established as an international precedent. How that gets implemented at a local scale, I think, is much more complicated because it has to do with your own legal doctrines and statute. In Texas, I would not forecast that Texas is anywhere close to recognizing water as a human right, as it would relate then to what that means for affordability or making water more affordable. So an example of that, just to put things in context, is there was a case several years back where South Africa, a community in South Africa, had petitioned to make water free because it was declared a human right. And that, of course, had compounding issues because, of course, water infrastructure is not free, right? And so it's a complex question. It's a good one, but I would say, generally speaking, I don't think Texas is close to that, but I think Texas in its own way is recognizing the importance of having stable and secure water resources, right? So as per usual, Texas is unique in the way that it addresses it, probably not with the same vocabulary that would happen on an international scale.
Thank you, Sarah. And Carlos, this question is for you. Thanks for the informative presentation. Is there an organization leading the charge on a campaign to rock the vote for Proposition 6?
Yes, they are. Sarah, why don't you help me out with that question as well, and then I'll give you my thoughts.
Yes, absolutely. So there are a number of organizations who are going to be advancing an educational effort in terms of direct advocacy. So money that's going towards direct advocacy. The largest effort is currently at TXOGA, the Texas Oil and Gas Association. They're spearheading a larger effort that is addressing 3 of the 14 propositions on the November 7th ballot. So there are 14 propositions. Many of them are infrastructure based. TXOGA is going to be addressing water, which is Proposition 6, as well as broadband and energy. So they are leading a charge in terms of direct advocacy, but there is a whole host of other organizations that are also going to be doing an education and communications campaign that are not able to participate in direct advocacy, ensuring that Texas voters are aware of it. And I guess just another kind of point of context, and I'll kick it back over to you, Carlos, is that as Carlos mentioned, water has tended to do very well when it comes to constitutional amendments. The last significant one was the creation of the SWIFT, the revolving fund in 2013, where Texans do generally vote very favorably. Voting polls, Texas 2036 had a wonderful poll during session that indicated that 88% of Texans were in favor of investing $5 billion towards water infrastructure. More recent polls that have come out have suggested that 73% of Texans have favorable votes towards Prop 6, the water proposition. Half of that, however, are soft yeses. And because there are 14 constitutional amendments, there is some concern that there's going to be some amount of voter fatigue or maybe confusion about where that money is coming from. So the fund that Senate Bill 28 creates and the $1 billion that was appropriated, it is coming from that reserve fund, right? And so there's definitely need to support broader education on it, but TXOGA is the primary advocacy campaign.
And what I'll add to that, thank you, Sarah, is one of the things that we're also doing, because Sarah mentioned in passing that there's other entities that are prevented from doing straight out advocacy. Just a little bit of an explanation on that. If you're a not-for-profit, then you need to be careful that you're not lobbying. And so that's a little bit of the nuance behind that. response. But those of us that are talking to communities, for example, a week ago, Rogelio, Hank, and I were in a county that we're assisting. We mentioned to the elected officials the importance of Senate Bill 28 and how they can be communicating themselves to their constituents as to the importance of how Senate Bill 28 can help address their needs and also address what Rogelio mentioned earlier, the philosophy of the affordability of water to be able to meet your future goals. I think the news media is actually doing a really good job in bringing attention to the fact that we have very substantive propositions to vote on. I know that members of the legislature through other trade organizations are also expressing their support, their strong support for a lot of these propositions that are on. And so there's a myriad of activity that is going on. And I think you're going to see it continue over the next 6 weeks leading into the election. Having said that, all of us that are on this webinar, please take time to talk to somebody else about the importance of passing Prop 6 in particular. And I'm saying that as an individual, not part of a not-for-profit.
Yeah, thank you, Carlos and Sarah. Along the lines of that question, and I know Hank has done a lot of work on this as well. Do you guys think that the legislature is starting to understand the importance of technical assistance? And is there anything that they could be doing in terms of policy interventions, perhaps thinking about future policy interventions in the next session?
I'll take that one, Rogelio, or at least I'll start. I think they're starting to get it. We had great bills that passed that, for example, Senate Bill 28 that included the technical assistance for line loss and additional flexibility for the board to contract out for entities for the provision of technical assistance. There was another bill that unfortunately didn't make it all the way through that would have created a stakeholder process, a process to bring folks together to help identify technical assistance providers, what gaps exist out there, and the need for additional assistance that is needed out there. There was also a bill that would have asked for the quantification and identification of communities that traditionally are left behind. You notice that in the logo for WFX, we have as a subscript, no community left behind. We know that there are communities that are applying for funding today that are not scoring high enough and are missing out on the limited funds that are available. So that gives you an indication of some potential technical assistance that is needed. What we don't have a good grasp on yet are the communities that have given up or given up temporarily, that they know, they themselves think, I'm not going to qualify, I'm not going to be able to get to the funding, so why even bother? I think it's critical that we have an effort to identify what's keeping those communities from applying. But I think we started that conversation during this last session. We all know that legislative action sometimes takes several sessions to undertake. I applaud the efforts of other entities, particularly Texas 2036, in advancing that discussion. I am very bullish, very optimistic that we have started down the right path of where we need to go. We're not there yet.
And I'll just add, I started my career decades ago in Washington working with Congress, and I would say that the level of sophistication about water issues here in Texas legislature exceeds the average level of sophistication in the Congress, which is a good sign. I've been very impressed with the questions they ask and the kind of bills that they're developing. So I think that's good. I think the one thing I would add to the answer is leading up to the next legislative session, we have an opportunity for everybody who's working on the issue to really collaborate. That's what this webinar is really about. It's really just to continue to move forward the discussion about how we collaborate and get the best facts together. And then the first stop on that process is obviously, and the focal point is the Water Development Board, is the state Water Development Board. and talking to them about these issues and where there's a need for clarity, then we can go to the legislature with a much louder voice to say, hey, here are things, if you could clarify, would really advance the ball.
I guess just an observation, big picture. This is what I'm here for, the zooming out function. I think there were several very technical and important concepts that were not as obvious, but occurred again in the undercurrent of the discussion. And some of those that really emerged to me, interestingly, were data. Data had a really significant role in how policy was discussed, water policy was discussed this session, without it necessarily being about water data. And that came in the form of the water loss report, which drove, of course, Senator Perry's Senate Bill 28, but it also came through in some of the discussions around groundwater management and mitigation, right? And so looking forward, I anticipate that we will continue to see some of those complex topics coming up in perhaps unusual forms, right? Data emerging in a stronger capacity. And in terms of workforce and capacity, one of the things that we heard very clearly in the sunset reviews was how much our agencies are really struggling with capacity, right? Our SRF program is 8 times oversubscribed, their staff capacity is, and so I feel like that was very well understood by legislators and hopefully will continue to be addressed moving forward.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. There's kind of a related question that I think is pretty overarching and good for the whole group on this call. But how can communities prepare to access SB 28 funding and or IIJA funding? So I'll start that, and I'd love Carlos and everybody else to kind of jump in. But really, it's about organizing and good projects, right? Getting together with other technical assistance providers, engineers, people that can help kind of translate what those problems are into good projects, shovel-ready projects. We are seeing a lot of competition, as Sarah just mentioned, for SRF money, federal money. And so that competition is kind of revealing itself in a way that projects really benefit themselves if they're shovel-ready, if your community's ready to go. Do water loss audits now as opposed to waiting for funding when they come in. I think those things and those preparations, we talked about base documents, audits, water loss audits, environmental, emergency preparedness plans, preliminary engineering. All those things will really give you a leg up when you're ready to access funding, because you can clearly describe and talk about the projects that your community wants to do for the benefit of that community.
Well said, Rogelio. I think that the other aspect of what communities can do is, for example, we talked about Senate Bill 28 looking for the creation of new source supply. Don't get stuck as a community for the biggest project that you can think of. It's important to be thinking about it. It's important to be to have that in your planning horizon. Do not pass up the opportunities that you have today to move on the projects that could provide you some element of the water you're going to be needing, some new source supply that you can actually implement in the nearer term. That would be my recommendation.
Yeah, that's great. And go ahead, Hank.
I was going to say, I'm from Chicago, and I used to say vote early and often. And I think for applicants, it's really apply early and often, meaning get in there early. These are new, still relatively new programs. You have to have your act together and obviously have your facts together, but get in early and don't try to do 100% at once. Do phases, get the initial phases in, because the victory infuses energy. And obviously, if you get a victory, even if it's only for part of what you need, then that gives you the energy, the momentum to move on. And it's a multi-year process, but doing the phases and getting started is really important.
And perhaps one more thought from me, again, with the human element, which is that assuming that Proposition 6 passes in November, and we hope that it does, Texas Water Development Board will have a lot of work ahead of it in deciding how all of this occurs, right? And that will be a longer process, and we'll have to wait and hear, how all of it occurs. But in the meantime, I would also strongly recommend that relationships and meeting with the board and learning about the resources that they do already have in place to start to think about some of the asset management and the rest of it is always a really good starting point.
No, that's great. I know we have 5 minutes left, so I'll turn it over to Hank for any closing comments, and of course Sarah and Carlos as well.
Great. Well, let me ask Sarah and Carlos, and then I'll wrap up.
Well, okay. One, I want to thank all of you all that were on the webinar. Let's keep talking about these water issues amongst those that we all have contacts with. I think it's important that we continue to recognize that our sources of water are continuing to decline. I think it's important to recognize that there is funding available to identify and create the new source supply that is needed. I think it's important to recognize that we have communities in Texas that have been left behind. And I think it's also important to recognize, and this goes to one of the questions that we had in the chat or in the Q&A section, that even though there's a lot of public money available right now, the clock is ticking and the money is going to run out. And that money alone is not sufficient to meet all of our needs. And so, yes, there are opportunities for regional solutions, regional cooperation, and yes, even for private capital investments in our water supply via public-private partnerships. All those elements are important. But when we do this, let's also recognize the value of the resource, and that is water. If we're going to develop it, if we're going to use it, let's use it wisely and let's conserve it.
Well said. I would say on a similar note, this is a wonderful opportunity as you're leading the charge, Hank, in broadening the definition or establishing a definition of what we mean by technical assistance. But I also think that Texas, because of where it stands with its infrastructure, with its water supply projections, is at a moment, an inflection point where there's also an opportunity to rethink what we mean by infrastructure, not just as built infrastructure, but also as nature-based infrastructure, as human infrastructure. And so I think that that's a wonderful opportunity for us moving forward.
Now, and let me just say something, all the agencies, all the communities online, you're not alone, right? Hank likes to use this term, and I think it's a great term. It's a crisis of opportunity. There's so much willingness to be able to accomplish these goals, and so many great organizations out there that everybody can partner with. We don't see that. You have to go it alone, right? There's help out there, and so we would love to be part of that. I know other collaborative NGOs and state agencies would love to be part of that. So to be able to realize a lot of the infrastructure, there's a lot of help out there.
As always, it's tough to follow these three. I'll just wrap up with a couple of things. First, that we've got all the questions. We're going to follow up and get you responses to some of the questions we weren't able to get to. One of them, I'll just mention briefly, was basically a question that said, are there some communities that are just too far gone and we just have to sort of give up on them? And I think the answer to that, of course, is no. There are communities in various levels of distress with various challenges, but we're finding ways, with regional solutions, for example, that can bring in, poor, smaller communities, colonias into broader regional solutions. And so, no, we would never start anything other than optimistic, but it is a big job. So I would say we hope that this is just the beginning of a process to keep these discussions going. It's not the beginning. There are good discussions going on all around, and I encourage you to, and we'll keep you informed about other organizations that have good things going on. We hopefully will work to help find a focal point for really refining definitions of technical assistance and figuring out what works. So I'll just close by saying, having been around the water field for more than 40 years, I don't think I've ever seen a convergence of factors like that exists in Texas today to support water infrastructure for underserved communities. It's going to be difficult, but the realities in the field make it imperative that we get the technical assistance right. We seek funding urgently, move quickly on that, and we keep communicating among ourselves about what we're learning and what works so that successes can be publicized and replicated more rapidly. But let me just say thanks to this stellar group of panelists and really a stellar group of participants. Thanks for your time, and stay tuned. This is a work in progress. Thank you all. Have a great day.